Shirin, I feel I have to thank you twice. One, for being here with us today, and secondly, for creating this piece, which is so breathtaking to me that it almost, it's very difficult to actually start talking after seeing the piece. It feels that there's really nothing necessary to say in terms of what it says. But I would like to start by talking about what brought you to artistically to develop this piece, and perhaps we can take it from there. You know, looking before and after it.
This was a very important piece for me, where I think it became an incredible leap and departure for me. As an Iranian artist whose work up to then had very specifically been dealing with the socio-political issues of my country, when I was asked by Philip Glass to create a short piece so he could compose the music, I searched for the concepts and subjects that seemed to, we could come under some sense of commonality and understanding. And for me at the time, and as I look at it today, there seemed to be nothing more poignant than the issue of violence and injustice and war and catastrophes. And at the time, I felt very compelled to make a piece that touched on the notion of grief, loss, mourning, and this was informed partially by loss of two members of my family, including my father and another member of family, but also had to do with the world events. At the time, I was very engaged in the subject of the Palestinian and Israeli conflicts. And somehow the notion of death and mortality and grief seemed to be an obsession. And yet I wanted to make a piece that was able to do that in a truly a universal language. And so it was the question of how do I negotiate with an American minimalist composer who's a man, and how could I come up with a subject and a film that we could have this deep sense of melancholy that we feel for the subject. And I was a little bit nervous about whether we were in fact going to succeed in that, but I feel at the end his music is deeply melancholic, and it affects me emotionally.
Well, I mean, when I see this piece, I think it's very interesting, the fact that it was made in 2001, before September 11th, and I wonder how did the piece change for you after those events? Did looking at the piece change after you experienced those, as we all experience these events?
For most of us who come from the Middle East, the Islamic countries, the subject of violence and death and tragedies, it's an everyday given. But so this piece came to me in some ways from that. But when September 11th happened, and I was so closely, as a person who was face to face with the notion of mortality, and putting aside the political complications of September 11th, it was really profoundly changed me. And what I think this piece taught me is how to go about looking for subjects that have those universal significance, that somehow, although iconographies and characters could be foreign, the issues are very humane and very common human experiences. And I think from this piece and September 11th, it made me lead on to create other work that in some ways, in my own small ways, seek with that notion of universality within my own sense of history and background.
But you didn't, before this time, when you started working as an artist, how did that sense of universality develop? I mean, because I think that your work was perhaps more specific about your personal situation or your personal biography and the situation in Iran when you returned. How did that develop from becoming more like a direct reference to like a more universal?
It's a very interesting question, because only recently, I think as most artists can, sometimes look back at their own work retrospectively and begin to analyze what has happened, I realized that the very early work that some people know me by, The Woman of Allah, was a work that I created after returning to Iran after the Islamic Revolution. And this work was really deeply a kind of a personal curiosity of sort of embarking on an understanding of the philosophical and ideological ideas behind the Islamic Revolution, and very clearly keeping myself on the outside of the polemic, and I was not taking any position. I could even say I was very neutral while I was making very provocative photographs that directly dealt with the notion of terrorism and martyrdom. Later, I was exiled as my work became a problem, and I was no longer able to travel to Iran as to this date. And now I look, and the work following that beginning of the time that I was exiled, it began to be another thing, where suddenly my knife became sharper in my critique of the Iranian society. My work, for example, Turbulent or Fervor, or many of my black and white films, although quiet and poetic in some ways, they were quite subversive and quite critical in many ways. And then came September 11th, and then that made me leap to another arena where, now that I've completely accepted the notion of exile, which I'm not very comfortable with it, but now I was in a society that I felt was my refuge, my security. Suddenly all of that idea was pulled underneath me. I felt completely threatened in the American society. So then I'm seeking for another terminology, a language that, what you would call a universal language, I suppose.
Well, I find it also interesting that, based on what you're saying, also that a lot of your earlier work includes yourself as the character, as a performer, and particularly pieces like Passage. Not only you don't see, we don't see you, but we don't see pretty much the faces of anybody. You know, it's a very anonymous, abstract sense of humanity, you know, which you can generally perhaps have create some sort of assumption of where you are or what's exactly happening, you know. But there's this absence perhaps of directness in terms of the person, and I think that's very different from your early work. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, looking at my work, I think my work sort of represents a conflicting energy in terms of the personal, individual aspect of the work and the social, political aspect of the work, but they always coexist. And of course, it's my personal life as it evolves informs my work. As I change, the work changes. As my point of view changes, the work changes, and it continues to be that way. But somehow, very often, I think the personal aspect of it is overlooked. The emotional, the poetic aspect of the work is very much about who I am and the way in which I can express myself with the poetic language most comfortably. Another is the anxiety. I live with intense amount of anxiety every day. Even today, as I sit here, this anxiety, it basically informs the construct of the work, the nomadic, the restlessness. And perhaps even that explains the movement that I make from one medium to another. So I think this sense of duality, contradiction, paradox, dichotomy is an inevitable core of my work. And it is that sometimes, for example, I see the tendency that I have to make extremely political work, and then I turn around and I make this work where I don't find it so political. So it tells me of my own tendencies and my own motivations that are sometimes in conflict with each other. And if I go further, I can take this to my own identity as an Iranian. We have been Persian, we have been Islamic. The Islamic Iran is very much politicized. Persian Iran is completely the opposite. It's a land of politics and mystics, and our way of dealing with the world, it's not politics, it's spiritual, it's mystical. And we have proof of that in our history. So no wonder why I, as an Iranian, feel very confused and have this crisis of constantly going back in between the political realities as we live today, that it affects my country and the world, and yet another most existential aspect. What is it like to be a human being? What do I feel living in this planet? What is my problem? So these are all the things that seem to be shaping the work.
Do you think there's a sense of restoration or a desire of restoring something that you feel you're losing in the work? I mean, I ask this question because I believe that after your first your first return to Iran, things have changed so much, and the Persian culture seems to be disappearing or not being taken over by the government to actually promote an entirely different reading of culture and history. And the fact that you use, for example, poetry and 13th century poetry in your work, I mean, does that come from a need of bringing that back? Or?
I think you have to understand the problematics of an artist such as myself. It's many. One is, who am I making the work for? Who is my audience? What should be the subject that I should be working with? What does the subject say anything to the world? Why should I make art? And to make it more complicated, my understanding of the work in the West, which is mostly seen in the West, is completely different than the Islamic or the Iranian people. I have a certain responsibility to my own country where the information that I engage in my work is authentic. And yet I want the freedom of expression as it doesn't exist in my country. In this world, there is the immediate issue of exoticization, orientalization of artists such as myself, the stereotyping of artists such as myself. And I don't mean just the average public, I mean critics. We have a lot of critics here today. There's the question of how does the artist, such as myself, bear the responsibility to translate from one culture to another, navigate from one culture to the other. Very often people say to me, why is your work always so political? Because politics has defined who I am, my past, my present, and the future. No wonder it has something to do with the way I think. I cannot think without politics. But it doesn't mean that I don't have the same needs as another artist from Germany or another. And so all of these problematic questions, and I don't mean problematics in terms of the negative, I think in terms of challenges. For an artist myself, what do I want to do next? What do I want to say to the public? In this time that the crisis of the Islamic versus the Western, the American conflict has reached its peak, believe it or not, it reflects some responsibility in artists such as myself. How do I do justice in carry on this equilibrium between not supporting my own oppressive government and oppressive fundamentalist Islamic groups, yet not be supportive of the American foreign policy, if I had to speak in those terms? And how do I make an aesthetic that somehow does not become a didactic, but yet does not ignore the critical time that we live in, that I must bear responsibility as an artist who comes from Iran? These are all the issues that I must bear in mind every time I decide to make a project. And it's not so easy.
Do you find a lot of pressure, like public pressure of you as an artist, as a very visible artist, to actually become some sort of spokesperson for either your country or the dissidents outside of your country?
Very much so. I mean, one of the terrible things that happened, predictable thing that happened after September 11th, I was bombarded by questions and attention to the work in the sense that was wrong, I think, because if there is in fact this question of lack of communication or sort of a gap between the Islamic world versus the Western world, I will not be the best speaker for that. It could be the people who live in the Middle East full time. For example, an Iranian living in Iran could give a far better reading of the society and the situation in Iran. The only thing that I could give that I could project is exactly who I am, is this kind of in-between, this exilic sort of byproduct, a binary artist who's constantly able to sort of bridge back and forth, but is never able to speak any truth of any matter, either about this culture or that culture. Therefore, I could never be regarded as an ambassador of that society. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, not just about me, but many of our artists who are truly nomadic. And the sense of home, center, purity no longer exists. I will never be a pure Iranian artist. My work is very foreign in Iran, the same way that my work would be very foreign in the West. And that is the reality.
What is the difference of perception of your work in Iran to places like the US? Do you sense that the audiences react differently to your work, or do you think that there's like a common reaction to it, to aspects of it?
The truth is that Iranian culture, since the revolution, the doors closed for a long time. And so there hasn't been much introduction or exposure to the Western art history. Meanwhile, I've had my education in America, and therefore my work is polluted and informed, not polluted not in a negative way, but my work, the construct, the medium, it's very Western, but my language is very Eastern. So for an Iranian who sees the work, I feel deeply they have an understanding on the poetic, the humanitarian, the mystical, the philosophical tongue that I'm speaking. It's very familiar to them. Yet the construction is very foreign. But mind you that Iran has gone through an incredible renaissance of culture, also particularly in cinema, ever since the revolution. So Iranian people are very sophisticated observers, particularly when it comes to film, particularly when it comes to minimalistic language, the poetic language, that many great directors have already established this as a kind of familiar language in our cinema. So it's also people are very critical, because they would say, oh, what does she have anything to say about our country when she's living out in America? My answer always is that just because I don't have access to this land, it doesn't mean that I have no rights to this land. My life has been as affected by this revolution and the political event as yours have, and therefore it has not been fragmented. And this is really the issue, so it's mixed.
What attracted you to the medium of film? I mean, was that rich tradition in Iran of filmmaking? Or how did you, because you started making photographs, and then you moved into video, is that correct? And then how did that transition evolve? Was it a necessity? How did it become the right thing?
There was a few things. I think I, as an artist, at times feel that the world of art is very small. The public, it's very particular. I have this desperate need and desire, since my work is very much about the society, the social, political issues. I have a desperate desire for making the work a little bit more accessible to the public. I think cinema, it's a great form of art, because in some ways it allows the meeting of many of the forms. For example, I could make a photograph in a film, I could make a painting, I could make a performance, I could make a poem, I could have many things all in one thing. Most important is the storytelling. I'm not sure if I always want to tell my idea in a single image. There is a power in the notion of narrative, how to construct a way of telling a story, particularly if the story is told through the image, as less with the word. And more so, as I said, I am a very restless and nomadic artist. I'm not very faithful to any medium, as I'm not skilled in any of them very particularly, and I get very tired of repeating myself. And so for the past 2 years, I've been working on my first feature-length film.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about that. But I'm also curious about a couple of things. First of all, when you construct your original narratives, do you depart from just specific stories that you want to tell yourself without necessarily disclosing them with the image, or do you think through connecting images, or how will these pieces go like as much?
If I could use the example of the film Tuba, which I'm very proud to have said that I shot it in Mexico, it was very interesting. It started with one idea. It was after September 11th, and I really had a strong reaction, yet I didn't want to make a predictable piece that directly dealt with that subject. Rather, I went to make a piece about paradise, a place where we could feel secure and safe. And the tuba, it's a myth that comes from the Quran, is the tree of paradise, it's the promised tree in heaven. And the garden, it's a very important symbol in both Islamic and Persian tradition, as they suggest the idea of paradise and heaven. So what more appropriate and poignant at the time of September 11 with the notion of looking, searching, haunting for a paradise. So I came to Mexico looking for that ideal tree of tuba and paradise, and ironically, very purposely, I chose Mexico because at the time I was very tired of going to the Middle East, and I wanted to go to a place that I felt safe. And I felt that way when I came to Mexico. And so the idea of this film, it wasn't really a narrative, as more than, it was more about a poetry. The three metaphors of the tree and the garden as one, the people who ran toward the tree, and the circle of men who seemed very religious and compassionate in one way, but extremely violent. So for me, it was this dynamic between very simple juxtaposition between these many conflicting forces, and all of us in a way looking for a place that we could feel safe. And so a film like that begins with a single concept, a single idea, but then the current film that I'm doing is far more complicated because it readapts a book.
Can you tell us about the book?
I read a book, actually, I've been very obsessed with this notion of paradise for a while, and the notion of exilic community. I read this book called Woman Without Men, perfect topic, and written by an Iranian woman novelist who herself is one of the foremost important Iranian women writers living in modern literature in Iran, and she's still alive. But she was heavily punished for her publications. She was imprisoned a number of times, once for 5 years, and one of the times for this book. This book, it's perfect because it's political, it's extremely feminist, it's mystical, it's very philosophical in many ways, and basically it's very sexual. It's the story of 5 women, each of them running away for one reason or another from some issues, whether it's sexual taboos, the society, oppressive situations. All of these women mysteriously leave Tehran, the capital city, and then they accidentally converge in this garden. This garden, magical garden. This book is written in the nature of magic realism. In this garden, these women, 5 of them, create their own society. The walls are closed to the outside world. They never leave. It becomes a kind of utopia where the rules of the outside does not apply. And there's one man in the garden, and that's the gardener, and he's God. So this incredible reference that she, as a Muslim writer, makes to the Garden of Eden, for example. I love the way she connects many things, but the most important part about this book, it takes place in 1953, where the Iranians suffered from a major American CIA coup d'etat, where it removed our beloved Prime Minister, Dr. Mossadegh, from power. And the Americans, with collaboration with the British, Dr. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil, which is very important, and that they reinstalled the Shah. And since then, we had many crises, of course, the American hostages, and eventually the Islamic Revolution. This period, for me, is really a significant period, not only because of the coup d'etat that changed the history of Iran, but also the beginning of the modernization and the westernization in the Iranian culture. And we have never been the same. That was the last time we experienced democracy before the CIA coup d'etat. And by the way, that was the first American coup d'etat of any foreign government. So for me, this historical perspective in the middle of this narrative that is extremely timeless and philosophical is superb narrative for our time. So of course it's taking me forever, but that's what I've been doing.
So what do you hope audiences get from this piece? I mean, it seems that you have a very, this is a very ambitious piece with a very strong objective, with creating it's a critical comment on history in a way, you know, and the impact of historical events have on us today. Do you have any sense of how the piece will end?
Right. It's very. It goes back to my earlier point, where I'm having. The reason it's taken me 2 years to write the script. It's because this balance that I must make between the philosophical versus the historical and political, and the Iranian versus the global. For example, I'm not interested in making a film, although speaking in Farsi with English subtitle, I'm not making a film just for Iranians. I want to make a film that when the audience looks at it, no matter where they're from, they feel very familiar with the subject, and they identify with the story and the characters. Oppression is not unique to the Middle East. We have oppressive environment in America today. Today is the inauguration. We have issues that are similar human experiences. How could I, without compromising the authenticity, the sociological values of this book that's rooted in Iranian culture, yet give it a universal significance? And this is very difficult. And how could I make still a beautiful film? Aesthetically, I love beauty. To me, image is very powerful. So I want to make a film when you see it, you feel emotionally charged, not just in your mind. So all of this kept in mind. It's tricky, and I think this is what I have to work very carefully at the end. And maybe it'll be a terrible film, but at least this would be my challenge with it.
Well, it will be also a departure in the sense that you will have dialogue in the film, right? How's that developing? Are you writing the script?
Actually, I'm working with many people, one of which is here, Shaja Azadi. I'm working very closely with the writer of the book, who we have adopted each other. I've fallen in love with this woman, and in fact, her life and her endurance, and she suffers from mental illness, and we have embraced each other in a way of doing this project, and that has been the most important event in my life for the past few years. So she is very involved in respecting me as an artist and my vision, yet the dialogues, for example, I'm not able to write dialogues, so with her help we are keeping, the words are very important, of course, and she's the one who's doing the dialogues.
It is interesting to me to see also that your work, it's really becoming more filmmaking in the sense that it's entering into the film realm, and because your career has in a way comprised both worlds, the film world, and let's say the museum, the contemporary art world. Do you see yourself like making a transition now into creating full-length films, or you don't know where your work will be placed?
I think the boundaries between mediums should be blurred more often. I'm very uncomfortable always thinking that as an artist I have to make a commodity, and that I would have to be always seen within the gallery and museum context. And yet I profit from that, and that is really my audience. But I think very often as artists, we're told to stay within the parameter of a small practice. I'm very afraid as I make this film. I'm filled with anxiety and fear of failure. But I think the subject of risk-taking, it's a really important one for me, and one that is not really encouraged in the world of art. Ever since I went to school, I was told, think about a style, an idea, and repeat it 1,000 times. I am the one who made those photographs with the writings, and as soon as people got to know it, I turned my back to it completely. Or later when I made these videos that were double opposite projections, they said, oh, she's the one who makes this gender. I didn't like that. I just wanted to resist against identification such as that. I think we need to take risk. And the greatest thing about film is that you, the world becomes your studio. Your laboratory becomes larger. And of course you're taking much bigger risk, much more money involved, people's money that you might disappoint, audience who may not like your film. But I don't know if I could do it any other way. And I think I encourage every artist who sits here today that we must take risk and challenge ourselves beyond what's told and what's, you know, I think within the common practice in the arts.
That's very nice. Well, looking back, you have really done a lot of work in the last 10 years, and actually the work has evolved in so many different ways. Do you feel particularly strong about a certain piece you made, or do you think one of these particular pieces that you made in the last 10 years is of crucial importance to your development as an artist?
You want me to be very truthful in front of an audience about...
Well, maybe which is your favorite?
I am very critical of my own work. I mean, I made this work, A Woman of Allah, and I had a very neutral position because I was this naive young woman returning with this desperate need of reconciliation with my country. And the subject of revolution became, believe it or not, a very attractive one. And the changes and ideological community that really lived with the sense of community, where I had been living in the United States by myself, where there was no sense of boundary. Everything was possible, infinity was your limit. And I felt totally lost. And so I came to Iran, and suddenly the sense of boundary sounded very attractive to me. And the sense of limitation, and even the veil, that, you know, I can't do this and that and that. Of course, I developed a romantic relationship with this idea of a revolution and my reading of it. But as I went along, and I became more informed in the history, it's a mistake, because failures should be a given and accepted thing for an artist. And artists should not be destroyed for making less of a good work. And this is a process for an artist to go through and deeply develop a character who can somehow help them to position themselves emotionally and artistically, and in terms of the career, I suppose. I'm saying way too many things.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, do you? Well, we also talk about the pressure of creating this final product. I mean, that perhaps is tied also with this pressure to not fail, right? Not to just experiment freely and just come out sometimes with a raw material that could never be a finished, polished piece.
I think, unfortunately, this is what I don't like about the art world, is the question of the way in which they judge. But then there's another thing, the question of, is Western criticism, Western audience able to truly and fairly evaluate a work of an artist who's not Western? I don't know. That's a question. If they're not informed about the foundation of my mythology, my iconography, my history, someone could say, hey, this is global time. The work should speak for itself. I should be looking at this work and be able to have my own reading. I say it's correct. But your judgment, it's very subjective to who you are, therefore, and where you come from, and your perspective. And therefore, this is a really important question for me, where I try truly trust myself as the best critic of whether I'm doing something right or wrong. And I continue to make mistakes. But if I want to get infatuated and pulled in many directions of people who support you, destroy you, criticize you, it's not productive. And I think this is a problem that I have. I say in the world of film, I find it slightly different. I don't think
yeah, how is it different?
A filmmaker is meant to make 10 films before they get destroyed, you know? I mean, we have great directors who make very good films and not so good films. And I mean, it's a question, I'm a new beginner at the film world, but I have a feeling that the whole scope of things are much broader. And also the question of filmmakers who come from third world countries, there's more space for artists such as that. We have fantastic filmmakers from Mexico who have transformed the face of the world of cinema today. It's great news to people like me. I think it's incredibly inspiring, and that their ideas are not borrowed from the West in terms of, but they're inventive, both in terms of the subject and use of cinema. I think there's much more room and attention in a very acute and more profound way on filmmakers who are coming from other parts. I'm going to get in trouble for having said all of this.
Aside from film, what other things inspire you to make your work? I sense that poetry is a very, literature is a big influence. Do the visual arts have ever created that kind of influence on your work?
Music has been a very important part of my work, and actually we should say a little bit about that. And because for Iranian people, a few things has really helped them through their crisis. And let me tell you, we've had a lot of political crisis. One dictator, one oppressive regime after another. I think what has really helped us to transcend the difficulties of time has been our poetry, our music, our philosophers and mystics, and that somehow allows us to leave the grounds of the mundane, and something more sacred happens. I think for us, for Iranian people, music is very sacred. Poetry is very sacred. And the sense of longing that comes with music is directly connected to the notion of mysticism that is practiced in Islamic tradition. So I don't mean sentimentality, but deeply emotional language. And I think for me, music, it has important significance for my daily life and in my work, where if the image tends to be political, somehow the music neutralizes that and brings back the sense of humanity, the sense of timelessness, and the emotionality that is necessary for our perspective in looking at these people. So music is...
Well, in terms of passage, how did that collaboration evolve with Philip Glass? Did he tell you what he was thinking in terms of the music score? How did you collaborate with him?
Well, up until I worked with Philip Glass, I've been working with an Iranian composer and singer, Susan Dehim, an extremely gifted woman who basically uses her voice as an instrument, unbelievable woman. And she's Iranian. We have both living in exile. We've had a lot in common. And so it was very comfortable working together. When I got invited by Philip, who, by the way, I really loved his music, but it was all about sound. It was no longer about vocal, about voice. It was about the simplicity and the resonance of sound as opposed to the voice. This was a big change for me, and I was a little bit afraid. And I think, as you can see, this film is also very minimal in its construction and its vocabulary. There's the earth, the air, the fire, the water, and there's the people. And his music, to me, had the same kind of simplicity. It's about choreography. And when I came up with the concept, I did a storyboard, and he said, go ahead, I like this idea, and I already know what instrument I'm thinking. I went to Morocco, I shot the film, came back and showed him a rough footage. He composed on piano, something he played for me, and I liked it. But I must admit, I was terrified when the orchestra got together. At first, it was too epic, too Hollywood for me. And I was like, oh my God. So I was really embarrassed, but I said, you must bring it down. There was too much percussion, too much... and so it was then the question of the women's voices. I said, you must use the voices I've recorded of this woman. You need that. This is the human expression. And this is okay, but can we make it rhythmic? So it wasn't like I signed off once I gave him the film, and I was very pleasantly surprised by his sensitivity of making sure that I feel comfortable. And I have to tell you, the music grew on me over the time. At the beginning, I was a little bit, taken back by the scale of it. But it really grew on me, and I like it very much.
Well, this is really wonderful. Thank you, Shirin. I don't know if you have any other words. We need to move on.
Thank you for having me back in Mexico.
Hopefully we can have you again. Thank you. Gracias. Haremos una pausa de 2 minutos para pasar a la siguiente mesa y continuamos.